He watched as the man was immediately directed to a teller. Harold clenched his jaw, but forced himself to remain calm. Maybe it was just an unfortunate mistake. Maybe she was simply distracted. But just to be sure, he approached the counter where a young teller was wrapping up with another customer. He patiently waited for his turn, hands in his pockets, glancing at the others standing in line. A well-dressed couple at the next window was receiving full attention, smiles, nods, and detailed explanations about their transaction. Then it was his turn. The teller, a woman in her late 20s with perfectly curled hair, barely looked up at him. "What do you need?" she asked, her voice flat and disinterested. Harold offered a polite smile. "I'd like to open a new high-value account." She sighed dramatically, as if he had just requested the impossible. "You need an appointment for that," she said. Harold frowned. "I checked your website before coming. It said walk-ins are welcome for new accounts." She barely lifted her gaze, barely bothering to make eye contact. "Yeah, well, not for those kinds of accounts." Harold glanced over at another counter, where another man in business attire was being guided by a teller who was walking him through account options with clear patience, handing him brochures, offering coffee. Turning back to his own teller, Harold asked, "So, just to be clear, if I look different, if I were dressed differently, you'd be treating me differently right now?" She blinked, her expression tightening. "That's not what I said." Harold tilted his head slightly. "But it's what you're doing." She exhaled sharply, clearly frustrated. "Look, sir, maybe another branch would be a better fit for what you're looking for." His fingers curled into his palms, but he wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. Despite the growing heat in his chest, he wasn't here to lash out. He was here to understand. So he took a deep breath, staying calm, and decided to play along. "All right," he said, his voice controlled. "Maybe I just need some information first. Can you tell me about your business account options?" The teller, clearly agitated, glanced at the line behind him and sighed once more. Without saying a word, she reached under the counter, pulled out a crumpled brochure, and slid it across the desk. No explanation. No attempt to walk him through the details. Harold picked up the brochure and flipped through it. He knew every word printed on those pages, but that wasn't the point. Across the room, another customer, a much older man in a blazer, approached a different teller and asked the exact same question. The response? Enthusiastic. Welcoming. The teller leaned forward, explained the benefits of the various account types, even cracked a joke to make the experience feel lighter. Harold looked down at the wrinkled brochure in his hands. "Is there someone I can speak to about account recommendations?" he asked. The teller pressed her lips into a thin line. "That would be the branch manager." "Great. I'd like to speak with them," Harold said. She hesitated for a moment, then, with the slightest smirk, replied, "He's always busy." Harold raised an eyebrow. "Did you check?" "He's always busy," she repeated, more firmly this time. After a brief pause, she turned to the next person in line without another word, effectively dismissing him. Harold stepped back and just stood there for a moment. It wasn't just bad service, it felt intentional. He looked around the bank, observing how others were being treated. The customers who looked like they belonged were met with courtesy, efficiency, and patience. Then there was him, unnoticed, unwelcome, unimportant. But Harold wasn't leaving, not yet. Not until he made himself heard. He wasn't the type to raise his voice to command attention. His presence alone had built an empire. But right now, stripped of his usual image and recognition, he was witnessing a reality he couldn't ignore. Without another word to the teller, he walked past her and made his way toward the glass panel office at the back of the room. The branch manager's door was slightly ajar, and through the small opening, Harold could make out a man in a perfectly tailored gray suit. He was sipping coffee while scrolling through his phone, clearly busy. Harold knocked lightly on the doorframe. The manager barely glanced up. "Can I help you?" the manager asked, his voice disinterested. Harold stepped forward. "Yes, I was told I need an appointment to open a high-value account, but I just watched 2 other customers receive full service without any issues." The manager finally looked up. His eyes quickly assessed Harold, his plain attire, the lack of designer labels, the worn sneakers. The polite, almost practiced smile that formed on his face told Harold everything. "I'd rather not deal with you right now. If you'd like to apply for an account, I suggest you try one of our other branches," the manager said smoothly. Harold's breath came slowly, deliberately, as he kept his composure. "Why would I need to go to another branch when I'm already at one of my own?" The manager's expression didn't waver, but his eyes narrowed slightly. "It's just a matter of weight." Harold didn't let him finish. Reaching into his pocket, he pulled out his executive ID and placed it calmly on the manager's desk. The action held a quiet authority that needed no further explanation. Suddenly, the room felt smaller. The manager's eyes flicked from the ID to Harold's face, back to the ID. His throat bobbed as he swallowed hard. "Mr. Kingston, I didn't realize." Harold tilted his head slightly. "Didn't realize what?" Just then, the teller who had dismissed Harold earlier peeked around the corner, her face now ghostly pale. The receptionist, who had barely acknowledged Harold before, now seemed very interested in her keyboard. The silence hung in the air, thick with tension. Harold let the silence stretch before speaking, his voice calm but sharp enough to cut through the uneasy atmosphere. "You didn't realize I was someone who mattered." The manager opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Harold leaned in, his gaze unwavering. "Tell me, if I hadn't revealed who I was, how would this have ended? Would you have called security? Would you have had me escorted out? Let me walk away thinking I wasn't good enough for my own institution?" The manager stammered. "Of course not, sir." Harold straightened up. "But you already did." The weight of his words hung in the air like a storm about to break, leaving everyone in the branch holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Harold stood still, letting the full gravity of the moment settle. The room was thick with discomfort, and no one dared speak. Everyone hoped this would somehow just blow over, but Harold knew it wouldn't. Not this time. The manager's face remained frozen in shock, but Harold could see the flicker of panic beneath it. The teller, who had dismissed him earlier, was standing near the counter now, her arms tightly crossed over her chest, desperately avoiding eye contact. Harold picked up his executive ID, slipped it back into his pocket, and in the same calm, steady voice asked, "How many other customers have you turned away like this?" Silence. Harold's eyes scanned the room, the tension thick in the air. How many people have walked in here, needing assistance, only to be made to feel small, dismissed, or told to take their business elsewhere? The manager cleared his throat, his voice barely above a whisper. "Sir, I assure you that's not how we operate." Harold let out a short, almost amused laugh. "I just watched it happen to me," he said, shaking his head. He glanced over at the employees. "And if this is how you treat me while I'm standing right in front of you, I can't imagine how your customers are treated when no one's watching." By now, the security guard had stepped closer, sensing a shift in the energy of the room. But Harold wasn't a man who needed physical force to make his point. Instead, he calmly reached for his phone, tapped a few keys, and hit call. "Good morning, Mrs. Holloway," he said when his executive assistant picked up. "I need an internal audit launched at the Los Angeles branch today." The manager's face drained of color. "Yes, today," Harold confirmed. "And while you're at it, have HR pull every customer complaint filed here in the past 6 months. I want names, details, everything." The employees shifted uncomfortably, the reality of what was unfolding dawning on them. Harold ended the call and slipped his phone back into his pocket. Then, he turned his attention back to the manager, whose face was now pale with the realization of the situation. The air felt electric with the weight of what was about to unfold. "You have 1 hour to gather your staff in the conference room," Harold said, his voice firm. "We're going to have a conversation about what kind of bank this is and, more importantly, what kind of bank it will be moving forward." The manager hesitated for a moment before nodding stiffly. Harold noticed, though, how the receptionist finally looked him directly in the eye and how the teller exhaled sharply, as if realizing just how much damage she'd done with a single moment of bias. It was a good sign. Change was coming. And this time, no one would be able to sweep it under the rug. An hour later, the employees of the Los Angeles branch sat stiffly around the conference room table, the air thick with unease. Harold Kingston stood at the head of the table, his hands resting on the polished wood. He wasn't here to yell, nor was he here to fire anyone on the spot. But he was here to ensure they understood the gravity of what had just happened. He let the silence stretch out, letting the tension in the room build before speaking. I built this institution from nothing. His voice was steady, controlled. Not because I was handed an opportunity, not because doors were held open for me. I built it because I had to fight for it. I know what it's like to be dismissed, to be overlooked, to be made to feel like you don't belong. And the fact that it's happening inside my own bank. He shook his head. I will not tolerate it. Some of the staff avoided his gaze, their discomfort palpable. The manager cleared his throat, but wisely stayed silent. Harold continued, his voice gaining strength. I walked into this branch today as an ordinary customer. I didn't throw my name around. I didn't expect special treatment. But what I did expect, what any customer should expect, is basic respect. He paused, letting his words sink in. What I got instead was excuses, dismissiveness, barriers thrown in my way for no reason other than someone deciding I wasn't worth their time. The teller who had refused to help him shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Harold's eyes turned to her. Would you like to explain why you assumed I wasn't here for legitimate business? Her face burned a deep shade of red. She opened her mouth to speak, but then closed it, at a loss for words. Harold gave her a moment before speaking again. Nothing, he asked, his voice soft but pointed. I just thought, she stammered, but her words trailed off into nothingness. Harold nodded once. That's the problem, isn't it? The room was painfully still, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Then Harold exhaled, shifting gears. I don't run my business based on who looks the part and who doesn't. I run it on trust, on service, on making sure that when someone walks through those doors, they feel valued, not judged. He met the eyes of everyone in the room. If you can't provide that, you don't belong here. A heavy silence followed. Then Harold continued, his voice firm. Now, here's what's going to happen. Every single one of you will undergo new training on customer relations. And this isn't going to be a quick seminar where you nod along and go back to business as usual. It's going to be real. It's going to make you uncomfortable because that's what change feels like. The manager, still visibly rattled, cleared his throat. Sir, you'll be the first one in that training, Harold interjected smoothly. Because leadership starts at the top. The manager immediately closed his mouth, realizing there was no arguing. Harold straightened his back. This isn't about punishment, he said, his voice steady. It's about accountability. People deserve better. And from now on, that's exactly what they're going to get. He looked around the room, his eyes meeting every nervous, guilty, and contemplative face. Then, Harold picked up his phone and typed a final message. A direct email to every branch, a statement, a promise, and a warning. From this moment forward, no one would walk into one of his banks and feel like they didn't belong. Not while he was in charge. Some lessons hit hard. But the hardest ones? Those are the ones that change everything. What would you have done if you were in Harold's position? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if you believe that respect should never be a privilege but a standard, hit that subscribe button because stories like this, they need to be heard.